Hello, everybody. Richard Clark back again. This is the fourth video in the series, and we'll pick it up where I left off with the publication of the Big Book in 1939 and what's been transpiring since then. So, just a very brief reminder that Bill Wilson wrote the Big Book on his own with a lot of influence from a guy named Hank Parkhurst, and that Bob Smith, who was in Akron, Ohio, and deeply entrenched in the Oxford group of that city, uh, Dr. Bob Smith was largely not involved and offered almost no feedback to Bill Wilson when he was writing the book. Bob Smith in Akron was quite convinced that obedience to the mandate of the Oxford group was quite sufficient to achieve recovery, and he had been long exposed to that fundamentalist Protestant evangelical type of religion. Bill Wilson in New York was aware that that sort of rigid and adamant presentation of religion might not be as successful, and he wanted to tone that down. And Bill Wilson wanted to get the message out to as many people as he could because Bill Wilson thought, that he had discovered something quite miraculous. So he decided he wanted to write a book and get it published so that people could understand what he did and could pick up the sort of the movement, the idea of addiction recovery or alcoholism recovery on their own. So the Big Book is published April 1939, and within a few years, it's gaining some acceptance. There are thousands of copies of the book being purchased and sold and distributed throughout North America, and then it gradually gets picked up in England and a few other places. So the success of the publication of the book is unquestioned. But what you have to understand is that the book was written in 1938, 1939, and it carried with it four things that Bill Wilson was trying to present to the public at large, but he was trying to explain it in a way that would be acceptable to most people. So, what he wanted to do was sort of initially describe his process of transformation from sort of 1934, early 1935, when he was a morbid alcoholic and destroying his life, and what happened to him in this sort of process of getting some recovery from his alcoholism and the writing of the book in 1939. He had wanted to describe that. But he also had to include some version of moral turpitude because he had been raised since 1895, he had been raised in an era in the United States where the temperance movement on the East Coast was quite prominent, the suffragette movement was quite prominent, and the suffragette movement gave some legitimacy to the temperance movement. So he was raised with the idea that alcohol drinking was some kind of moral turpitude or a sin, and that in order to consider yourself an effective member of that Protestant culture, in order to really be accepted by the people at large, some aspect of forgiveness was required. Second thing he wanted to understand and explain to people was what he had learned from Dr. Silkworth, that there was this kind of two aspect approach to addiction. The first aspect was, according to Dr. Silkworth and what was presented by other doctors, was that alcoholism, or the consumption of alcohol, triggered an allergic reaction to alcohol, which was a disease component of alcohol consumption. And that once you drank alcohol and this allergic reaction kicked in, what you would end up with was this sort of obsessive compulsive mental problem that you had to keep drinking. So those were the two things that Dr. Silkworth presented to Bill Wilson when Bill Wilson was in treatment at Towns Hospital. And as I said before, when Bill Wilson was in Towns Hospital being treated for his alcoholism, he was under the influence of three very powerful drugs. There was morphine, there was psychoactive medication that caused him to think differently, and belladonna, which was a very early version of a manufactured hallucinogen, where Bill Wilson had the white light experience, believed that this was a communion from him, from God to him personally, and that fit in with what he had learned from an associate of his who had talked to him about the Oxford group surrendering to God and finding peace in prayer and forgiveness. So all of this had to be presented in the big book. Now, over the next 10 years or so, Alcoholics Anonymous and the distribution of the book, AA became quite prominent. There were a number of featured articles written about it, and it really gained a lot of social acceptance because Bill Wilson did something that nobody else had ever done, kind of in the history of the world. So for many decades prior to 1939, everybody understood that alcoholism was this kind of morbid, diseased condition of self-destruction. And understanding that it was some kind of a mental illness or some kind of a disease was becoming prominent in the minds of well-informed people. So Bill Wilson presenting that in a book wasn't really big news. I mean, it might have been big news to a lot of people who read the book, but certainly to a lot of well-trained professionals, that was the presentation that they had been familiar with. What Bill Wilson did in the big book was he presented a solution, and that was his version of the 12 steps, which he took from the four principal tenets of the Oxford groups and expanded into the 12 steps, which was a description of his process in going from being a nasty alcoholic to being somewhat of a spiritual person. And Bill Wilson's intent in writing the book was to tone it back or to soften the message that you had to be a sort of a fundamentalist Christian. Now, in that presentation, that alcoholism was a kind of a moral failure and you had to seek forgiveness, that it was a two-pronged aspect of disease and mental illness, and that there was a path based on a kind of a rudimentary Christian view, was new. And so if you could reduce that to its most basic, what he presented in the early AA literature was that sobriety could be obtained on a daily basis by associating with people who didn't drink. And the number one condition of the whole thing was that a person maintain some kind of sobriety on a daily basis. And the way that you did that was by reaching out, asking for help, associating with people who didn't drink. The second thing was that acquiring some belief in God was necessary, and that in that belief in God, some version of forgiveness for moral turpitude was necessary, and that the 12 steps must be very specifically followed in order to achieve some version of recovery. Now, that took us through till the late 50s. And as Alcoholics Anonymous was gaining in popularity, what happened in 1952-53 is a group of people on the west coast of the United States around Los Angeles took the concepts that were presented in the big book for alcoholics and rewrote them and recast them into a different focus that were good for drug addicts. And that was the birth of Narcotics Anonymous, which has an important influence in what happened over the next 25 or 30 years. So by 1955, or 1953, we have Alcoholics Anonymous, which is successful for 14 or 15 years. In 1953, we have the birth of Narcotics Anonymous on the West Coast, and that gradually became more and more successful. And to understand there's a different social structure between what we understand alcoholics are in 1950 and what we understand drug addicts are in 1950. In 1950, the big book was written for white males, Protestant Christians over 35 who were heavy drinkers. And there was a kind of an exclusive club. If you were a homosexual, if you were a drug addict, if you were African American, if you were a woman, there was a hesitancy in getting you involved in the recovery process. It's well known by people who have read the literature that it was 4 or 5 years before we had a successful female participating in addiction recovery. And it was so exclusive that early Alcoholics Anonymous meetings didn't want African Americans, didn't want non-Christians, didn't want homosexuals, didn't want drug addicts. They were a very exclusive club. And in that version of recovery, up to 1950 or 1955, certainly into 1960, being recovered from the illness of alcoholism required two things: that you understand and train yourself to be a good Christian, and if you were a good Christian, a good Protestant evangelical Christian, and you sought forgiveness for your sinning ways, if you were a good Christian, then you could be a good member of society. Now, with the advent and the success of Narcotics Anonymous, some credibility was gained that these sort of lower class street addicts that were generally frowned upon, they too could recover some social respectability by beating their addiction through the 12 steps. This all changed. Now, as I said before, there's 2 or 3 things all happening at the same time. This all changed in 1987 because up until 1983, 84, 85, in that area, alcoholism and alcohol consumption, if you were an alcoholic, was kind of tongue-in-cheek referred to as a disease or an illness, but there was a very, very predominant focus that you were a sinner and required yourself to find God, seek forgiveness, and make restitution for your sins. What happened in 1987 was the American Medical Association got involved in the whole thing, and they presented to the American public and to medical professionals that addiction was actually a disease that had 2 components to it. The first component was that there was this actually disease component where there might have been an allergy to alcohol, and in early recovery from alcoholism or drug addiction, very often there were disease and medical components that needed to be addressed by medical professionals. In 1987, they understood that when people were getting clean and sober, they might need treatment for broken bones, they might need treatment for stitches, they need treatment for detoxification, they need treatment for long-standing medical concerns like autoimmune illnesses or diabetes or mental health issues. All of these things started to be codified and recognized in 1987. That there was a specific need and requirement for doctors and medical professionals to be involved in addiction treatment. That addiction was actually a disease, and that there were a lot of sort of related aspects to addiction that needed to be treated by doctors. And that's all fair. And then at the same time, the doctors, in cooperation with psychiatrists, started to create the idea that there was this definite illness component, this obsessive compulsive, very self-destructive mental attitude that was involved in addiction. So the respectability of the American Medical Association was presenting something that was in contradiction to what had been long-standing in Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. The American Medical Association was saying that this was a disease with mental illness components, and Alcoholics Anonymous was continuing to present that there was this moral corruption and sinning involved because of the 150-year influence of the temperance movement. And that attitude permeated the consciousness of people who were trying to understand addiction. And the long and the short of it is that if alcoholism or drug addiction is a moral corruption, if you're a sinner, then you have to, I guess, seek some version of Christianity and beg forgiveness. But if it is a disease like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, paranoia, if it's a disease like diabetes, if it's a disease like HIV, if it is actually a disease, our society gives leeway and acceptance to people who have schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease and diabetes and HIV, and these people get legitimate treatment as having a legitimate disease that's recognized as not requiring forgiveness. So, if all of a sudden you end up at the hospital and somebody says you're schizophrenic or somebody says you have diabetes or HIV, the medical community and the psychiatric community will not tell you that you have to go to church and seek forgiveness and find God. It's recognized as a legitimate illness. But if you go to a treatment center that is involved in the traditional approach to drug addiction, many of the counselors and therapists in treatment centers will tell you that you have to find God and beg forgiveness for your sinning ways. And these two things create a kind of a very subtle and undisclosed schizophrenic crack-up. If an addict who's new in recovery and confused and lost and lonely is being told that they're a sinner and they have to seek forgiveness, that's one thing. But then when they talk to doctors and psychiatrists, they're told that they have a disease and a mental illness. That's something else. And I am of the opinion that addiction is very specifically a disease with a mental illness component, and it has to be looked at that way. We have to find some way of addressing the inculcated guilt and shame from the persecution of addicts by religious groups in society over the last 150 years, that they're somehow morally weak, which doesn't hold up. So, that's a significant thing that has to be remembered in everything I'm talking about from now on. So that's the end of this video, and I will begin the fifth video in a few minutes, and we'll carry on from sort of the creation of Narcotics Anonymous and the involvement of the American Medical Association. Thank you.